All right, so welcome everyone to this session's PhD reading group. Just to give you a brief introduction of myself, my name is Ki-Jong Kim. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of South Carolina, Moore School of Business. And in this session of AOM's IM Division's PhD reading group, we'll be hosting Professor Timothy Devinney from the University of Manchester for a discussion about being an intellectual scholar rather than just being an academic researcher. Now, of course, this holds a great amount of importance to us, especially junior scholars as well. So just to give you a brief background about Professor Devinney, he is currently a professor and chair of international business at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester. And prior to this position, he was a professor and university leadership chair at the University of Leeds and also pro-dean of research and innovation. He is also professor conjoint at the Faculty of Medicine at Macquarie University. It's in Australia. And he has also in the past held positions on the faculties of the University of Chicago, Vanderbilt University, and UCLA, and also has been a visiting faculty member at numerous universities across Europe, for example, Copenhagen Business School, and Asia. Just for an example, HKUST, Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. In terms of publications, he has published more than a dozen books, for example, The Myth of the Ethical Customer, and also more than 100 articles in leading academic journals. And just to give you just a brief examples which include Management Science, AMR, the Academy of Management Review, Journal of International Business Studies, Organizational Science, and Strategic Management Journal. Regarding editorial roles that he holds, he's currently the co-editor of Academy of Management Perspectives and co-editor of the Advances in International Management series, and the founding editor of the Annals in Social Responsibility and Foundations and Trends in International Business and Management. So just to give you a background of the very basic overall webinar is that it would be approximately a 40-minute talk along with a 20-minute Q&A session. We have sort of organized the questions that you all have asked, but please feel free to also ask questions in the chat, and we'll take care of them after the talk from Professor Devinney. So without further ado, I will leave the floor over to you, Timothy.
Okay, thank you, Ki-Jong. I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of more a philosophy of things, rather than the usual things that you might get. So, being kind of a slightly different scholar than what you might normally see. The one thing that Ki-Jong didn't highlight was my background is actually quite different from most business academics. I started in psychology and applied mathematics. I ended up going to business school and getting PhD without actually ever applying to the PhD program. I ended up with a master's in public policy and an MBA in economics and statistics, and my PhD was in economics. It was actually a mathematical economics dissertation, a non-price theory of credit rationing, which was actually an information economics dissertation. And I spent the first 10 years of my academic career mainly teaching economics, law and economics, industrial organization, statistics, mathematical economics, things of that nature. And a lot of the publications early on were in things like Journal of Economic Theory and different types of kind of economics journals. So I started in a very different way than other people. And also I never really started thinking about things in the way that I think most doctoral students and most junior faculty today kind of find themselves in a world in which it's not publish and perish, but it's kind of publish in the right journals, or perish. So you can still publish, and you can publish and perish if you don't publish in the appropriate set of journals that your institution wants. And this has always been to me a real dilemma because many of you will have gone through seminars on kind of how to publish in top journals. which I find I actually have done those myself because been a journal editor over the years. But but the reality is that those are somewhat mind-numbing um, discussions because they never really tell you the truth. And in some sense, the truth is not very pretty. And the truth is you actually have to be fairly smart. You have to be fairly intelligent. You have to be fairly uh, competent in the things that you do, and you have to be incredibly lucky. And so there's kind of this combination of sort of skill, kind of the way in which you communicate, and luck associated with it, because the reviewing process is highly variable. But with that's done over time, and this is where I'm going to come into the point of this webinar, is where people have lost sight of what it means to be a scholar. I don't like the term researcher. Whenever I tend not to use it, because being a researcher is in some sense a yeoman's job. You're plowing a field. You don't have to be particularly intelligent to be a researcher. You don't necessarily have to even be terribly skilled to be a researcher. You can be a bad researcher. In some sense, it doesn't take a lot to be a researcher of, kind of varying quality. What is really hard to be, and this is the term I tend to use, it's really hard to be a scholar, and it is even harder to be an intellectual. And in my office, I have a bust of Alexander von Humboldt, who, if you don't know him, that's pretty bad on you. So Google him pretty quickly. But I won this thing called the Alexander von Humboldt Forschungspreis from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Germany. I'm the only person in management who's ever actually got that award. They give out about 40 of them a year, typically to kind of scholars across broad range areas. In my case, I got from that, I got a professorship, and I got a cash prize, which was significant. Okay, it's not Nobel Prize significant, but it's not a chump change. And one of the questions was, well, okay, well, why did I get that? And it was kind of interesting because um, nobody on the panel that makes the choices for these things was a management scholar. The closest would have been an economist, maybe psychologist or sociologist. But it's a broad panel, right? It's got physicists and it's got chemists, it's got, sorts of different people on. And I think that it said something about the nature of the way in which I did my work, but also the sort of people who nominated me for this, because you can't apply for these things. You have to be nominated by a panel of people, and obviously the better the nominators, the better you do. So my approach to what it is that I've done over my lifetime has been somewhat different than others. I've never focused on journal publications. I've never focused on publishing at all. Publishing is a kind of an output associated with it. And at times I've had low output and been criticized for it. And sometimes I've had high output and I've been rewarded for it. And the only thing that's happened is I've lasted long enough that has kind of leveled out over time to the point where it's probably okay. So I think that it's important in some regards to really ask the question, why am I doing what I'm doing? So one of the things I did just before doing this, right? I mean, being the typical lazy scholar that I am, and also having access to AI systems, I actually asked the question to various AI systems, which is probably the least intellectual thing that you could possibly do. Okay. But what I did is I figured, well, let the machine trawl through all human knowledge and let's see what comes out of this, right? And it was interesting because I used Chat GPT, and I used Perplexity, and I used Claude. They came out with slightly different views of this. Um, None of which I think were kind of really reflective of what I want to say, but I'll give you a few examples of this, right? So Chat GPT comes back and says, here are a few dimensions that define someone who's called an intellectual. Love of ideas. I think that's a pretty good one. Critical thinking. not necessarily the case, because I don't think that many people who think that they're intellectuals would make an argument that they don't engage in critical thinking. Okay. I think my dog thinks it engages in critical thinking. Okay. Engagement with society. I don't necessarily think that this is the hallmark of an intellectual either. Okay. Openness to debate, which I do think is probably a hallmark of an intellectual. Not necessarily that they like it, but that it is kind of part of a process. And independence of thought. Okay. And that is a willingness to to hold unpopular opinions. Okay. And I think that potentially stands out as one. Now, if you go to perplexity, perplexity says, well, again, critical thinking, enjoys studying, learning, and discussing complicated subjects. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're very good at it. You just enjoy it. Um, Communicates ideas effectively. I don't necessarily think that's true of many intellectuals. Anybody who has listened to a French intellectual would make an argument that they do not communicate simply. Demonstrates a high level of curiosity, which I do think potentially is one of those, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, which I do think is an issue. Okay. And integrates knowledge from different domains. And I'm going to come back to that because I think that that's partially an important part of this. And then when you get to Claude, Claude comes back and says deep analytical thinking about complex ideas and questions, probably pretty good. A commitment to pursuing knowledge and understanding, which I think is a good one. Willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and active engagement. So I think Claude is probably the closest to what I want to talk about. And really where I think the part of the difference comes in, and that is that with all of these is they don't really capture what what it means to move from kind of working on a subject, in other words, being a researcher, just following a furrow kind of research idea, to moving to through a degree of where you engage in scholarship, which I think is a more deep thinking around the ideas, to the point where you really have kind of the mantra of an intellectual, where you're really using ideas, you're really looking at problems, um, in a way that brings to bear this, a wide range of angles on which you can study a problem. And one of the reasons I have this bust of Alexander von Humboldt in my office is that Humboldt was a real intellectual, right? I mean, he was a philosopher, he was a botanist, he was a biologist, he was an explorer. I mean, if you ever read his journals, right? I mean, there are cities all over the world named after Humboldt, right? He was, probably the 19th century's foremost um, scientist and intellectual when it came to kind of understanding natural phenomena. And this is where I think a lot of this comes in. And so the first aspect of this, which I think is important, right, is uh, I would view myself as a 19th century intellectual. And that is, I'm very interested in natural philosophy. I'm very interested in observing the realities around me. Okay. And that doesn't mean from the standpoint of just looking at a problem, with, I'm going to study a problem and, oh, I've got an RVB lens, which everybody and their dog seems to use as a lens. Um, it's really sitting back and being reflective of the environment around you. And I've written, for example, I've write also for newspapers, and I've written a lot of things in kind of public arenas. And I wrote a book with a colleague of mine about universities. And so I've been highly critical of universities. I've been highly critical of university leadership, which I think is a misnomer. I don't think that there is such a thing as university leadership. I think there's a lot of university management and a lot of university administration, very little university leadership. But one of this is has been due to the fact that as a scholar, as an intellectual, I actually have spent a lot of time observing myself and observing everybody around me and observing the systems around me. And then ask the question, okay, how can we make this better? How can we make this, what's really the issues here? All right. In other words, cut through all the political and you know, administrative baggage, which the university doesn't want, right? Because they don't want self-criticism. They don't really want to be self-reflective, but to be reflective of that. So one aspect of this is to be observant, but the other aspect of this is to be capable. And this is where I think a lot of junior scholars make mistakes. And I think that if you wrote down and ask yourself the question, what is it that you do with your time? And now I know currently if you're a doctoral student in junior faculty, you're sort of saying, well, I'm just trying to survive, right? I'm spending an enormously large amount of time working on my dissertation and trying to or get through my classes or do whatever it is that I need to do. Um, but it's the trade-offs that you make with your time that matter a lot. And what that means is that means what else do you do with your life? And one of the things that I think is extraordinarily important is to not get focused, 100%, 24/7, 365 days a year on the topics you're working on. So I'll give you, a number of examples of this. Um, I read an enormous amount, constantly read. And this is a habit I picked up, from many years ago, due to my school. I grew up in an inner city in Pittsburgh, which was not exactly the greatest, most privileged background in the world. Um, but the but the reality was that I had a good kind of classical education, which meant that I read everything. By the time I was out of high school, I had read all of Dostoevsky, all of Flaubert, all of Tolstoy, all right, all of Balzac. I mean, you work your way through literature. We had a real traditional kind of classic education. But the other aspect of this is history, literature, art, chemistry, mathematics. You work your way through all of this, right? And you ask yourself this question, well, why were these 19th century scholars and intellectuals, what made them so different? And the answer was that they didn't have TikTok. They didn't have Netflix. They didn't have the distractions, which are kind of like fast food, right? In other words, that bag of chips looks really good compared to, something healthy. Um, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they're actually they're the bag of potato chips. They're the French fries of kind of intellectual discourse. What that means is it means that part of what you have to recognize is that there's no you have to do things which you don't necessarily know what the returns are from those. And I'll give two examples of this, right? And as when I started out as an undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon, I was studying psychology and applied mathematics, which meant that I had the opportunity to work with people like Herb Simon and Alan Newell and people like that, right? So really true intellectuals. But the thing that was really interesting was that I never took a business course, right? All my courses were in the hard. I had a bachelor of science, so it was in chemistry or it was in mathematics or it was in something else, right? Um, but at the same time, I was still taking courses in Greek literature, in Greek, Latin literature, in Latin, right? So because I'd learned this stuff in high school, right? I was still actually saying, well, there are all these other things I'm really interested in. I'm going to keep doing those. But the thing that was really interesting was I took a bunch of philosophy courses, and I've now for the last 30 years taught a philosophy of science course at various universities all around the world. And one of the things that's interesting is that I'm now actually 40 years later writing articles of philosophy of science. Okay, writing articles referencing things that I had done when I was an undergraduate. The same thing was true with, for example, the book, The Myth of the Ethical Consumer. One of the things that I've done is I've done a lot of experimental work, a lot of experiment, and in fact, I've got a company which, has some patents and other things where we have access to this stuff. Um, and one of the things that was interesting was that work originated. A lot of that work originated from my undergraduate days. The work I'm doing now on populism is related to work reading and stuff I was doing when I got my master's degrees in public policy at the University of Chicago. And so part of this is you know how much of your time is devoted to broadening that perspective. Because part of the problem that you have is as you observe the natural world, as you're looking at things and trying to say, what's interesting about this? If you don't know other things, if you don't know enough about, let's say, physics or art or math, or history or sociology, then your perspectives become really, really narrow and blinded. Okay. And this is why you typically find articles which will kind of have these very unitary perspectives. They'll say that they're interdisciplinary, but they're particularly unitary. A second aspect of this is when I won the actually no, it was when I got the Alexander von Humboldt Award. The thing that I met a guy by the name of Jeff Malpas. Jeff is a philosopher. He's probably the world's foremost expert on Heidegger, which is probably a pretty bleak thing to be. But one of the things I do when I meet people is I look what they've written, particularly academics and others, and I go and get it and I read it, right? So I asked Jeff. I said, "Look, Jeff, can I have some of your books?" And he said, "Yeah, sure." And he sent me a bunch of his books, right? Um, one of the articles I wrote in the Global Strategy Journal, on global monetary democracy was actually related to one of Jeff's books on Heidegger. And this is something that I do all the time, and that is that I seek out people. I seek out, for example, talk to physicists, right? I will go to seminars in other parts of the university. Okay. I will just simply try to be involved with this. And even now in the digital world, I will sit with four monitors when I'm working. And I will actually have two of the monitors on which I'm doing kind of the work I'm supposed to be paid to do. And then I will actually have a podcast running or the news running, um, on one or the other of the monitors there. And then typically I'll be so I'm actually engaging in all of this. Right? And I think that this is where a lot of people get sucked into kind of the career aspects of this. And this is why, if I would look at many of the fellows of academic organizations where I'm also a fellow, the percent, even there, the percent of true intellectuals, individuals who are really broadly thinking about a problem, who can look at the complexity of that problem, bring in different perspectives to that problem, right? Not necessarily being interdisciplinary, because they may not be an expert about that perspective. They may have to go and get an expert around that perspective, but they understand that perspective. They can get into a debate and a discussion with that on that perspective. If they're in a room with sociologists and medical professionals and lawyers, right, they actually can have a broad conversation. Okay. Whereas when we go to many of our conferences, and it kind of can be really pretty mind-numbing because there isn't this breadth of perspectives. Right? There isn't this openness to these ideas, and you don't really see these perspectives coming in. That's really where I see the difference with the intellectual. But the problem is that if you want to be an intellectual, if you want to move that way, okay, you have to devote time to it. Okay, and that is that one of the things is that typically researchers peak in their 40s. Right? So if you look at kind of publication and research output, That typically peaks for most people in their 40s. Okay. But to be an intellectual, it peaks at when you're dead. In other words, or you go senile because that process is one where you're still adding to that perspective and that base that you've got. Okay, it doesn't decline. And the return in some sense is a long-term return. But what that means is that means that you probably have to take 20% of your time or 25% of your time and say, I'm not going to focus on the next publication. I'm not going to focus on my next class. I'm going to focus on something that's broader. Okay. And I'm going to read outside my area. I don't necessarily know if what I'm going to be reading is going to be adding anything. It may add something 20 years from now. Right? I don't know. I don't know what it's doing. Right. In other words, an intellectual is a venture capitalist. It's a kind of personal venture capitalist where you're doing all of these other things and some kind of component of what it is that you're doing. And then and not necessarily knowing whether there's going to be payoff for it. Okay, there may never be a payoff for it. But I mean, in some sense, you'll find over time that increasingly there does become a payoff for it, because you can start to look at problems in ways that other people aren't looking at. You can actually enhance your classroom far more significantly than you might otherwise think, and then just kind of having kind of dry business examples of a problem. Okay. You can engage better with people on the outside. You become interesting to people, right? Because people aren't interested in researchers unless they're looking at a very specific problem. People are interested in intellectuals because there's a curiosity associated with the breadth and perspective that they can bring to a problem. And the better they're able to do that, right? There's a skill to being that. You can be in some sense a bad intellectual who can't communicate very well. But you can also have this other perspective. So as I look on it, that's where I would really kind of, you tell people, in other words, think about that what you're doing with that other part of your life, because that other part of your life can actually be built in this. Okay. In other words, how you travel, how you gain experience, what you read, what you watch, how you delve into problems. And to be honest, I published a lot of things which have been based upon things that I did or read decades ago, but never knew that I could. But all of a sudden, I sort of say, hey, that stuff that I did, back in the 1980s or 1990s. Okay. I now have a base to use that. Okay. And some of that can be highly unpopular. I would have to admit. Okay. Some of it may drop like a rock, because it's really hard in some sense to exist as an intellectual in a world that's fundamentally anti-intellectual. And the last thing I'll say is that one of the books that had one of the most profound impacts on my kind of mental development, intellectual development, was a book by a guy by the name of Douglas Hofstadter. I read it in high school. It was called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. It's actually classic. And 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 one of the things is the work that a lot of work I've done recently on populism, right? We have an article, two articles actually, which we're going through working on. Um, but I teach a class for people in political science at Manchester, about the history of populism in the United States, which talks about the development of the United States all through its history, and also religious revivalism through U.S. history. Okay. And actually go and make an argument. You can't understand Trump. You can't understand the current circumstances. Okay. As just a short term. Oh, let's look at, the disparity of income. Okay. In the United States, and that explains populism. No, if you don't understand the history, right, and go back and look at the evolution of that history, okay, you actually don't have any clue about why Trump exists. Trump is actually not an anomaly. Okay, Trump is a progression from the past. Okay, yeah, sure, he might look like, sound like Hitler or sound like Mussolini, or gesture like these people. But you actually look in American history, you actually see lots of this. Okay. You see lots of examples of this, and you see an evolution of this, okay, which has kind of led to the outcome that we have. Now, you can't go back and change the history associated with that. But to think that it's a short term, oh, if we just wait it out 4 years, this guy will, drop dead or be gone. Okay. And then we can get back to normal. That's actually ignoring the historic perspective of this. Okay. And I think that's where you start to say, okay, there are people who can research the problem of populism, and there are people who can intellectually understand the problem of populism. And there's a big difference between the two. Okay. You just simply have to be technically strong with an understanding of literature, and have a database to research populism. That doesn't mean you understand it. Okay. And that's where I would say that's the thing that you really want to try to aspire to, because intellectuals are rare. Okay. Researchers are common. Okay. Scholars are a little less common. Okay. But the true intellectuals are really rare. Um, and if you can achieve that, I think that's a really that's where you can put something on your gravestone that materially matters rather than your Google citations. Because I jokingly said that what I'm going to do is when I drop dead, I'm going to put a scrolling line that updates my Google citations on my gravestone, um, you know, as a bit of a joke. Anyway, so that's what I've got to say. I'll now open it up to kind of moderation of some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Timothy, for the great talk. Just we've organized some of the questions from the audience. So to just go first over them, the first question is, how can early career scholars stay true to their intellectual interests while also being pragmatic about tenure track and like publishing expectations?
Yeah, yeah. I think this is a good question. I saw this before. I think that the reality is that the only way that you can be the best you can be is to survive long enough to be the best you can be. In other words, there's a bit of a hygiene factor associated with tenure processes and being successful. Um, the and it is true, although I think it's far less true today, that professors have more freedom than junior faculty members. Um, I think that in today's, I wouldn't call it a corporatized university, but it's sort of the all administrative university. Um, the power structure has moved away, from the faculty in many places. The truly best places, I think the faculty still have a big voice, which means that as you progress through your academic career, you get far more flexibility. But in many other arenas, it becomes a real trade-off. So, but one of the things that you sort of have to recognize is that being an intellectual, is not a well-paying job. It's not even a well-paying career choice. If you look at the history of many great intellectuals, it was a history of personal poverty. Um, and what that means, there was a lot of dependency on being able to pay the bills. And so what that means you have to figure out what the percent of your time you can truly devote to um, you know, anything other than the mundane things on which you get measured. And that I think is increasingly difficult. Again, I can kind of talk about ancient history, which is related to my career, I guess. But it used to be when you would write a tenure letter, particularly in the United States, back in the certainly in the 90s, 80s and 90s or whatever. Um, and when I was going up for tenure, people didn't care all that much about the volume of your output. Obviously you had to publish in good places. You had to, but what people were far more interested in was the quality of the ideas, rather than the volume of the ideas in specific places. Now the reality is that you are metricized. And what that means is that means that you have to ensure that you can hit the metrics. And I have some colleagues who were remarkably good at gaming the system. I mean, it used to be that what they would do is because in a number of places, even professors get reviewed, but they get reviewed over longer periods of time, right? And in a few places I've been, they had metrics that even professors had to meet, and some of the professors would front load this, and what they would do is that they would time when publications would come out, get it into the next cycle, say, okay, I've got my minimum number that I need to keep these clowns off my back, and then what they would do is then they would go off and they would spend the next 3 years doing the things they really wanted to do. And so it becomes a real issue to sort of say, okay, how much risk am I willing to tolerate in terms of this? Okay. And with my career, if you looked over time, there were kind of peaks and troughs, and that's pretty typical of people. Okay. The difficulty is that under the systems today, um, they're kind of confining you into windows and sort of saying, well, you can't have a trough in a window, right? I mean, otherwise you lose your bonus or you lose part of your salary, you get a higher teaching load or whatever it is, right? And I've been threatened with these things, by the way, in my career. I've even had some put on me, where I had my salary cut and my teaching load increased because they told me I wasn't performing. In fact, I was told at one point in time I should go on to a teaching contract, because my research career was clearly going nowhere. Okay, how'd that work out? But the problem I think is really be able to manage that. Okay, and that I don't have a really easy answer because I think it's a much harder to do, than otherwise. I mean, uh, the guy who developed the Higgs boson, Higgs, right? He published virtually nothing, over his career, right? And I think he was at Edinburgh, is that Edinburgh or Glasgow? I can't remember exactly which place he was, right? But he was interviewed, and they were sort of saying, well, look, the only reason I haven't been fired because he didn't meet the performance criteria was because they thought I was going to win a Nobel Prize, right? He said if they didn't think I was going to win a Nobel Prize, I would have been fired years ago. Okay, so that problem, is one which is kind of endemic in the system as it is, which means you really have to just say, okay, this is the basic performance benchmark I've got to meet, and I just have to work to that. But I would be extraordinarily protective of my other time. And that is that Anita McGann once gave a talk. There was a session with me, her, Max Bazerman, and I think Denise Rousseau, where her talk was how to say no politely. In other words, how you can get out of having things which really add no value to you. Okay. In other words, many jobs that you get asked to do as an academic are really mindless jobs. And the only thing that the dean or the head of your school or whatever really wants is for some idiot to take that job and get it off his or her desk. Okay. And those are the jobs you really have to avoid, because they're time sinks. Okay. They don't really add anything to your intellectual development. If there's another opportunity where you can use it for your intellectual development, then you grab those opportunities so that you can double up on those. So the trite response to this is be very protective of your time, know how to meet those benchmarks, And when you're asked to do additional tasks, try to avoid tasks which don't add to your intellectual development.
Um, yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great answer. And I think we also have another recurring question. So that would be, how do academic employers evaluate the intellectual curiosity of candidates before the interview? And how could this be reflected in the written application?
Well, look, I think that there's a number of things that it depends on the person and the institution. Um, there are places where really all they want to know is how many FT50 papers you can generate. Okay. You are, from their standpoint, um, kind of part of the machinery. Um, and and even within places, there are places. I mean, there are things like that. I had a conversation with one of my colleagues, in which he had a high opinion of somebody and I had a low opinion of somebody. And I said, well, and he said, well, but the guy's got like, 5 SMJ papers or something like that, right? And I said, yes, that's fine. I said, but have you read them? And I think that that's where the difference comes in, right? Because if a group is not performing, then in terms of the metrics, then it becomes hard for that group to survive. If it's not performing in terms of the nature of the generation of student income, it's going to be hard for that group to survive. Right? That's why many IB groups in the United States disappeared. Relative to other fields of endeavor, with respect to students, in particular with respect to students, and interest from MBAs and others, IB was simply not as good at promoting itself and being effective. And it lost out to entrepreneurship and strategy and innovation for the most part. So I think there is that aspect of it. For me personally, um, I follow what I call the best athlete rule. And that is that the best athlete rule means what I really want to do is I don't want to draft for position, right? In the United in American sports, they have drafts from college, right? And the real question is, are you drafting for a position? Do you need a quarterback or do you need a point guard, or something of that nature? Or are you drafting, just to have the best, if something, outstanding talent? And so for me, I tend to look at, okay, does this person really think deeply about a problem? In other words, you know, uh, are they not just mechanical? Do they really, have they kind of engaged in that kind of natural philosophy observation? When you talk to them, you can see that they understand the nuance and the depth of the problem and maybe the history of the issue. They really understand the depth of things. And then the second thing is that they have to be technically competent. That they have to be able, ultimately, to deliver, because some of the smartest people I've ever known have been abysmally poor performers. They're extraordinary intellects. Okay, but they can't execute their intellectual capabilities in a way that generates written work, or in today's parlance, it might even be generating podcasts. Okay. Um, but the main point of that is, they have to have effective intellectualism, in terms of it. Now, recognizing that junior scholars won't have the breadth of the experience that comes with this, right? And this is one of there have been many studies of this, but there's one in particular which I remember, which asked the question, when do different types of artists um, peak? And and what they found is they found that artists who have very specific narrow skills, okay, but or it could be savants like Mozart, peak early. Pretty much it's over by the time they're 30, right? So they pretty much should die a grisly death at 35 because it's going to be all downhill from there. The more integrative types of artists, Picasso being a good example of this. Okay. They don't seem to have a peak, right? Because back to my example that being, kind of truly good at this kind of intellectual endeavor um, is is um, is kind of never ending. And that's actually true. And this article also looked at other types of skill sets and showed fundamentally people who are more integrative, who see broader pictures, who integrate lots of different ideas, who have broader perspectives, who dig more deeply into problems. These people don't peak until late in their lives. And therefore, when you're looking at junior people, you really want to make sure that the person has the technical capability, as well as the curiosity and all the other things, to get to the next stage where they can start to potentially develop and expand and move from just being a competent researcher to being, somebody who can kind of move through being a contributing scholar and then, potentially beyond that to kind of the nirvana of really being a kind of true intellectual. And I think that's important, right? Because the main point is that all of us go through, probably five, six, seven, eight, nine, 10 transitions in our careers. Okay. At any point in time, we can actually go and do an off ramp, not necessarily of our own volition. Okay. And the thing that's truly amazing to me is that people survive at a high level of intellectual performance, given all the pitfalls associated with, what happens, when the ideas you're working on no longer become important. What's the next area of work you're going to work on, right? Because if you think you're going to walk in at the age of 30 and walk out at the age of 65 or 70 or whatever, and you're going to still be doing the same thing, that's a big mistake. And that's why when you get to people sometimes who are really, kind of at the top of their game at 60 or 70 years old, they typically have some other redeeming feature about them. I mean, some of them are just lucky. Some of them are just lucky in the sense that what they were working on in day one is what they're working on in day, 100 days later, or when they're 70. That's one way to do it, but that's a pretty unlikely thing to happen because we know researchers tend to peak early, um, and therefore you tend not to see quite the same thing. Others, and if I would look at it, I would say, the people who I really have a lot of respect for intellectually, these are people who have really, they've worked on lots of different things and they've managed to sort of kind of make it work, continue all these transitions in their career. And I think that's a hard thing, right? So yeah, but that's what I look for. That's the sort of thing I look for. And typically I will not necessarily go with the crowd when it comes to um, recommendations. I mean, I've literally been in groups where everybody said, "Oh yes, this candidate's appointable," and then they get to me at the end, and I just say no, and I give them my explanation as to no, and I would say in 9 times out of 10 that candidate doesn't make it through, because the arguments are different. I'm looking at something that's different from what many of my colleagues are looking at and kind of saying, okay, well, can this person teach the classes we need? Can they generate do we think they can generate the publications? Um, and I'm thinking about, well, you know, what's this person going to be like if as a professor? I mean, in 5 years' time, what's this person going to be doing? Um, and whereas other people tend to look at the resume in front of them and the presentation in front of them, and they want to make a decision on that. I don't want to make a decision. I want to make a decision on, what I see that person being in 10 years, 5 or 10 years time.
Yeah, thank you so much for the insights, Timothy. I think maybe we can open up the floor to the audience. Maybe we can take like one or two questions max. So if any of you guys and girls want to ask a question, please feel free to speak out.
Hello, good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Devinney, and also Dr. Kim, for this opportunity. I'm just picking up on your last question. I should say, first of all, thank you for the very thought-provoking and inspiring discussion. I think it really spurs my mind as to how someone can really develop from being a scholar to an intellectual. And just picking up on that conversation or that answer you were providing about what you look at when you see an academic that's different from what other colleagues might see. I would want to know from your perspective, what then would be a piece of advice that you give to an early career researcher or someone who has finished their PhD in the past few years on how to get to that point and present themselves as an intellectual when they're talking to other colleagues, either in an interview or a presentation or in their general relationships? And also, what is one thing that has helped you get to the point that you are in your career today that's different from what you've already provided or mentioned?
Uh, well, I'm hoping to get to retirement, but that's a different question. No, I think part of it comes down to, I go back to this issue of observation. Okay, and that is that you know it's always been very interesting to me at how you know seemingly extraordinarily bright people um who argue about the integrity of doing kind of scientific work are so bad at doing scientific work about themselves, or about the institutions around them, right? Who don't follow their own advice. And 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 what this means is, it means that, for example, when you're going into an interview, you have to understand who the people are that you are interacting with, right? You Because those individuals will have their own very specific biases and their own specific ways of looking on things, right? And they will have they won't have they won't be looking at you at the way you think they're looking at you unless you understand the perspective that they have. Okay, it's very game theoretic. In a sense that what you want to know is you need to know a lot about them to understand how it is that they will respond to you. So part of it is that when you go into these sort of environments, such as an interview, or even doing corporate work or teaching a class or whatever, right? Flipping that perspective matters an enormous amount. And you may not like it. So for example, I flip the perspective on my students all the time, and I hate it. Because I don't see success in how they're engaging in observation today. Okay. I've never taught undergraduates, by the way. I've had the distinction in my entire career of never having had to teach an undergraduate. Most of my career was teaching MBAs and executives. Um, when I came to the UK, I started to teach master students, and they're very different from MBAs and executives. And I don't like the perspective that I see coming from, but I understand that if I just teach the way I taught to the MBAs and executives, that I'm going to get the result that I want from these students, is foolish, right? In other words, I have to kind of flip around and understand what are they seeing when they're seeing me there? So from the standpoint of doing things like, job interviews and in that, you have to understand that. Because if you don't really understand that, you get a really biased view of what the outcome could potentially be. Okay. You may be the absolute best candidate for a position based upon the silly list of key performance indicators that are on these that are there. Okay. But the reality is, if you don't know, for example, the the career trajectories of the people who are interviewing you, um, you don't really understand what the metrics are that they're doing, right? Because the metrics that are written down, that you've written, kind of your application for the job based upon, may not be the ones that are being used to make the decision, right? In other words, you can be as much of a threat by being good at the things you do, right? Um, if you take a perspective of somebody who might, let's say, not be as confident, or their career might not has worked so often, or you have to have this ability, right? It's very Rawlsian from a philosophical perspective, in other words, to take the position of the other. So I think that that's extremely important. The other aspect of this is that you have to show that you're more than just a teaching and publishing machine. Now, it varies by institution. Okay, I would say that in some institutions, and particularly post-COVID, at many institutions, um, there isn't as much human interaction at schools anymore. You can show up in your office and be the only one there because everybody else is working from home. Um, but normally, when people are hired, nobody wants to hire somebody that they think is going to fail in 3 years and not be there. So you have to actually be interesting to to people. And this is where this kind of more broad kind of aspect of what your personality is, what your interests are beyond just being, a teaching and publishing machine. Okay. And because you're not, I'm not a big believer of organizations as family, because if organizations were families, they'd be murdering one another. So that whole notion, that we're all part of one family, is just total nonsense. Um, but you have to recognize you have to live with these people. And you can't operate well in environments in which you don't have some degree of support and collegiality. Okay, so think about it this way, and that is suppose that there's an issue between you and the dean. You take a job someplace, there's an issue between you and the dean, or you and the department head, right? Who's got your back? Okay. Let's say that you're right. That it's an issue that uh, is related maybe to your workload, or promises which were made that everybody knew about, which are now being reneged on. Who's going to stand up for you? And you'd be surprised. I mean, I know some, people who, you think you think from their external persona that they're really supportive of people, and they're kind of upright sorts of people. And then when somebody needs help, that those people are nowhere to be seen. If you don't fit in, you really can't make some personal linkages, then it becomes hard in that environment. Okay, where it's necessary for somebody to sort of stand up and say, well, hey, you know, you can't do this to Ollie because, this was a promise that was made. And by the way, if you do that, you're not only going to upset her, you're going to piss me off. And and the last thing you want to do is piss me off, right? And because they might not be afraid of you, but they might be afraid of me. And I was actually when I ran this research center in Australia, I mean my the person who managed it, the person who was the administrative manager, you know, she used to say, don't ever let people know you're a nice guy. And I said, why? And she said, because I need you as a nuclear option. I need to be able to bring you out and say, well, if she didn't wasn't going to get what she wanted, she would threaten to bring me in to the conversation. And the last thing that people wanted was me to come into the conversation. All right. So she sort of said, look, just keep it up. This is really great. We can get lots of stuff because, because of that. Okay. So you need those people. And if you aren't kind of broadly speaking, part of a larger community, um, you know, at your institution, then it becomes a problem. Um, and I've seen both sides of this. I've seen situations where, and I've been involved in situations where, it didn't work out well, and people were hurt by it. And I've been in situations where, with the support of other people, it had been, it had been resolved. And some of these things will come up, and they might not be, crisis level things, but for example, you're being asked to do a job you really don't want to do, but you feel that you're pressured because of your position that you can't say no. Okay. And it's a lot easier for, say, somebody more senior to walk in and say, hey, you just can't do this. And that's healthy thing.
Thank you so much, Prof, for your response. Thank you.
Yep.
All right. I think for the interest of time, I think we can conclude this session, this PhD reading group session. So we thank you so much, Timothy, for your time and the great points that we all for sure can think about throughout our academic careers. And we also thank you so much for the audience for your attendance as well.
Oh, that's fine. It's not a problem. Okay, thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks for putting up for me for an hour. Have
It was great.
a good
Thank you
day.
so much for
Okay,
doing this.
thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.